Morning. How's everyone going? We're good? Yeah, great to be with you today, whether you're here in the room or you're online with us today. Wonderful to be with you. And we're starting a new series today. We're starting a new series where we're going to be deep diving into the book of Daniel. So we're going to be exploring Daniel over the next few weeks. And we're going to be looking at how do we make a stand. Everyone say stand. Stand. How do we make a stand for God in our lives? We're going to look at how do we stand out? How do we stand up? How do we stand strong? And how do we stand firm in our faith? And we're going to be looking at the life of Daniel and in the book of Daniel and that narrative over this little time. So you can actually join us if you'd like this over this series and be reading the book of Daniel. There's a reading guide that's on our website, or you can pick one up from the point and you can follow with us in that way. We want to thank Life Church and Pastor Craig Rochelle, who's been doing a little bit of work around this area, and we've adapted it into our context, but we want to source that and say thank you to him for the work that he's already done in this area. I want to ask you a question about standing out. How do you stand out in the right ways at the right time for the right reason? How do you do it? How do you stand out in the right ways at the right time for the right reasons? Now, we've all probably had times in our lives where we have stood out for the wrong reasons. There's probably been times in our lives where we've embarrassed ourselves, or, we've said something that we didn't think was funny and people laughed, or, we spilt something on our clothes and we had to walk around kind of awkwardly trying to hide it. We've probably stood out for different reasons at different times in our lives, right? I remember one time that I stood out for all the wrong reasons. It was Michelle and I were newly married, we were living in London, and we went to Paris for our anniversary, which sounds like, oh wow, that's really cool, right? But when you're living in London, you can go to Paris for your anniversary, you're 2 hours on a train. It's like going to Victor Harbour for your anniversary, okay? And it's kind of what it's like. And we were there in this in this French restaurant in the heart of Paris, and I was trying to pull all the right moves. I wanted to make sure that this was a special occasion for Michelle and I on our anniversary, and we'd had this really nice meal. And then at the end of the meal, I got the waiter's attention, and I said, "La cuenta, por favor." And I thought I was being really smart, asking for the receipt in another language. And Michelle looked at me and she said, "Mike, that was Spanish." And the waiter, in a classic sort of French dismissive way, didn't really worry about what I said and said, "Oh, I'll go get you the bill." I stood out for all the wrong reasons at that moment in that time. But what about standing out for the right reasons at the right time in the right ways? I think as a church, we just did that last weekend. Last weekend, we were raising both awareness and funds for modern day slavery. We would all say that modern day slavery is not okay. 40 million slaves in this world. It is not okay. More slaves in the world than what live in Australia. It is not okay. And last weekend we got to play our part, raising funds and joining into a much bigger story. That's good in terms of standing out in the right way for the right time and the right reasons. And today I want to have a conversation with us in the short amount of time that we have together about what does it mean to stand out in the right way at the right time for the right reasons. So if you've got your Bibles or your phones, let's turn to Daniel 1, because we're going to be sitting in Daniel 1 today. Let me give you some background information. There's this king at the time. His name's King Nebuchadnezzar. All right, and King Nebuchadnezzar, he's a very bad man. He's an evil king. He destroyed Jerusalem, he burned the temple, and he burned and he crushed the Israelites' religious symbols. This guy was not a fan of Yahweh, Israel's God. He was into Babylonian culture and gods and pagan worship, and he was destroying what the Israelites stood for. Not only did he destroy the city, the temple, and the religious symbols, but he attempted to destroy Israel's future. Because what he did was he went on this, this campaign to get the youngest, the best, and the brightest young men and try to indoctrinate them into Babylonian culture, language, and their religion. And Daniel 1 verses 3 to 5 says this. He says, then the king, so this is King Nebuchadnezzar, he ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. And the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. And they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that were to enter the king's service. So basically what King Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do was he had this campaign where he was like, you know what? I can actually obliterate the Israelites' future by taking their best and their brightest and turning them into what I want and what I need. He wanted them to come into his palace, eat his food, and work for him. And verses 6 and 7 goes on to say this. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief officials gave them new names. To Daniel, he gave him the name Belshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. You know, Bible scholars would say that these 4 young boys were between the age of 12 and 15. They were young. They were young middle school boys. Some in this room, in that age group right now. These were young boys. They were middle schoolers. They were so young and so fresh. And what King Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do is he wants to change their name and he wants to change their diet. Because part of indoctrinating them into a new culture is for them to forget the past, to embrace the present, to prepare them for a future which was very, very different to maybe what they had grown up with. And the issue is kind of twofold here. There's one around their original names, and then there's one around the diet, around the food. You see, these guys, their names were given to them by their parents, and they were tied to their worship of Yahweh. They were tied to their worship of their God, their one true God. So there was a real significance in their name. So their new name would have been tied to false pagan gods. And added to this, the food at the king's table, it seems really great. Like if you're a middle school boy, 12 to 15-year-old boy, and you just get at the king's table before you, you get the food and you get the wine. Do you think that's a good deal? Well, that's a pretty good deal. You know, there'd be a fair bit that you'd like about that. But the issue with the food is it's dedicated to pagan gods. So the food is not food that would represent their God. So eating this dedicated pagan food, this food that's dedicated to pagan gods, that crossed a real line for these guys. And verse 8 is really central to our conversation today, and particularly in terms of making a stand. And it says this, it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Very important in a conversation today that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, but yet he asked for another way. So it's very interesting what's happening here in this narrative so far, that when Daniel and the boys are presented with a new name, they're like, you know what? That's probably not ideal. It's not something that they were really keen on, but when it came to eating food that's dedicated to pagan gods, that crossed the line for him. And it's like Daniel is sort of saying, I'm going to take a stand when it's God's name that's going to be defamed. When it's God's name that's being defamed, I'm going to make a stand. I'm not going to let God's name be insulted by me eating this food. So it crossed a line for him in that. And what I love about Daniel in this moment, and this is so important as people who follow God or people who are exploring what it looks like to follow God, is that Daniel made a predetermined resolution. He made a predetermined resolution. Before the temptation was presented to him, he already decided that he wasn't going to engage. He pre-decided, and I believe that is a huge part of why he was successful. He had resolved in his heart and in his mind that he wasn't going to defile himself with this food. And imagine if he hadn't made this pre-decided decision, and all this food is presented before him. Imagine what might have happened in that moment. He might have just said, "This is great. I'm 12 to 15 years old. I eat out of house and home anyway. Mum and Dad are going to be really happy about this. I'm just going to embrace it. I'm going to eat it. I don't care. Let's get around it. Let's get amongst it." He might have gone that way. Or he might have maybe rationalized the situation and said, "Well, I was chosen to be part of this new world. I don't really understand it. I know it hasn't got a lot to do with my God, but maybe I should just go along." Or maybe he would have looked left and looked right and said, "Well, all the other Jewish boys are eating up. I better eat up too. I'm going to eat up," and just go about it. Or maybe he just sort of thought, just this one time. Just this one time. Gee, the food looks good. The wine looks great. I'm going to get around it. Just this one time, but not again. But here's the key. He predetermined. He resolved in his heart ahead of time, and he made a decision before he was faced with the temptation to do what is right. It's predetermined. He made this decision to do what is right ahead of time. And I would argue for many of us who are followers of Jesus, our success in God's eyes, what God thinks of us in so many areas of our lives, will be determined by what we decide ahead of time, before the temptation comes. And we see this in a range of different areas of our lives. For example, in our workplaces, how we treat people, how we make a decision to treat people ahead of time, how we make the deals that we make, our integrity, how we share our faith in a real and relational way. Or what about in our relationships? And let me speak specifically into our marriages, how we love and speak and treat our partner when people are present and when no one is around. Or what about with our finances? How we honor and how we bless God by giving into his kingdom work. The decisions that we make ahead of time, the predetermined decisions to stand out for what is right, they set us up to live a life that pleases God. I remember when I was at university, I made a decision ahead of time. When I was finishing year 12 and I was starting university, and there was a bunch of new people that I was going to get to meet, and just this on this kind of like, this start of a whole new journey. I made a decision ahead of time that I really wanted to build relationships and share my faith in a real and a relational way with those that I was going to come in contact with. I made that decision. And I made a decision that I wanted to go out with my mates. I wanted to go to the pub. I wanted to hang out with them. But I made a decision that I wasn't going to get drunk. I wasn't going to keep drinking. I was going to have a couple of beers, and then I would have some water or some soft drink or something like that. It was a decision that I made ahead of time. And I went to a sports uni, and I did human movement, and then followed by PE teaching. And my mates, they thought it was a great game to try who was going to be the first guy that got Mike drunk. There was probably a bounty on my head. And that's just sort of how it worked growing up in that environment. But I made this decision. I want to hang out with these guys. I want to get to know them. I want to share my faith. But I wasn't going to cross some lines that I knew God didn't want me to cross. And what was fascinating is some of the conversations and some of the relationships that you build. After your mates have a couple of beers, the sort of things that they want to talk to you about, and the things that actually you get to invest in with them as well. What was fascinating is about 3 years into our uni degree, I was playing golf with one of my mates. And we were playing golf, and he said to me, "Mike, you don't know this, but I've been watching you." And I was like, "Oh, gee." And he could have been watching anything. And I was like, "Oh, okay, what's going on?" He goes, "I've been watching you live your faith out at university." He said, "I've been watching how you make decisions. I've been watching how you deal with some of the issues that we all are dealing with." And he said, "One thing I haven't told you is that my partner, she grew up in the church. And she grew up in the church and she's wanting to reconnect and re-engage in the church, but I have no idea about church or faith or anything like that. It's got nothing to do with my upbringing at all. But I've been watching you. And I said, oh, well, what do you want to talk about? And he said, well, I've been watching how you can stand up against some of the guys and not force yourself on anyone, but you're the same person. You're authentic, you're genuine in how you go about things. And that was really nice to hear because I've been working really hard at trying to do that. And he opened up a conversation about faith and about how he was wanting to explore what it looked like to follow God in his life. And he began a journey of faith that he then put his trust in Jesus. He's got baptized. He's now married to the same girl and they're raising their kids up in a faith family. It's a beautiful thing. Absolutely beautiful thing. And what a privilege it was for me just to play a little role and journey with him in that. But I'd pre-decided when I got to uni. These are the things that really mattered to me. Building relationship, sharing my faith, and I didn't want to cross the lines. Was I perfect? Of course not. No way. But I'd pre-decided in my life to live that way, and God, by his grace, showed favor and opened up opportunities for me to share my faith with my friends. So to stand out, you may need to predetermine some things, to make some resolutions in your heart ahead of time before the temptation comes. And it might be things like this, that you're going to make a decision not to get involved in office gossip. You're just not going to do it. Just don't do it. Just if you hear stuff bubbling up or you get drawn into conversation, no, it's not for me. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to tangle myself or triangulate myself in these sorts of conversations. You might make a decision that you're going to stay sexually pure until you're married. It's something that's really important for you. And you're going to walk that line. You're going to honor God with your body. You might make a decision that you're going to be a generous person. No matter where you find yourself in your life, that you're going to be generous with your time and your resources and your finances, because you know that to be a person that follows God and to please him is one that lives a life to bless others. You might make a decision that you're going to be in church each week. You're going to be in church, you're going to be in the room, or you're going to be online because your spiritual formation is a priority in your walk with God. It's a predetermined decision. You might make a decision that you're going to be an engaged participant in a life group. You're actually going to bring yourself. You're going to be open. You're going to be vulnerable. You're going to share. You're going to faithfully pray for the people in your group because you know that we've been created for community. Or you might make a predetermined decision that you're going to be committed to sharing your faith in the places and the spaces where God has put you. In your street with your neighbours, in your workplace, in your family. That Christianity is not going to be something that you consume and fills your tank, but actually you live in such a way that you share your faith with others in a real and a relational way. And these things, they just don't happen. We have to take intentional steps towards growing in our faith and being a person who stands out for Jesus. Because if you've pre-decided in your heart to live for God and to honor him, then you will stand out. You will. If you've pre-decided this in your heart, that you're going to be a person who lives for God and you're going to honor him with your life, I'm telling you today, you will stand out. You just will. Because the values that you're living by are kingdom values, and they're great and they're so very different into the world in which we live in. So let me put it another way. If you're not standing out, if you're living a life where you blend in, if you would say, Mike, I don't stand out, I blend, then I want to encourage you with as much influence I have in our faith community to have a look at that before the Lord. Because if we're blending in and if we're not standing out, then how are we fully following Christ? How? It's a question for all of us, myself included. What happens next here is very insightful and it's very wise from Daniel. Remember, he is a middle schooler, so don't put the young men down here. When it comes to standing out for God, this is what Daniel did. He got on the solution side and he presented an alternative idea to the guards. In verses 11 to 16, it says, Daniel then said to the guard, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and they looked better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guards took away their choice food, the king's food, and the wine and the drink, and they gave them water and vegetables. So Daniel didn't protest or cause a scene, did he? It's really fascinating here. He didn't kind of say, "Oh, this isn't fair, this is an uproar, you don't understand my past, you don't understand our God, you're doing all these wrong things." He didn't protest and cause a scene. He simply asked to try something else. This is fascinating. If you're in a situation where there's potential conflict, or you're in a situation where you don't know where the impasse is, look to see what Daniel did here. He simply asked to try something else. And by doing this, he opened up another conversation. You know, plenty of people stand up for what they're against. Plenty of people cause a scene. And maybe there is a time and a place for that. But Daniel stands up for what he is for. And he changes the narrative by being solution orientated. He actually brings an alternative idea. So instead of sitting back on his hands and saying, "This isn't fair, this isn't going anywhere, I can't deal with this," he actually says, "Hey, here's another idea. Can we try this? How would this work?" He got solution orientated. And then what happens next is simply amazing, verses 17 to 20. "To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kind. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than the magicians and the enchanters in his whole kingdom." Wow. Like, this is amazing. This is amazing, the favor and the opportunity and the door that God opens up to these young men that made a stand for him. It's absolutely incredible. God gives the boys supernatural knowledge and understanding and favor with King Nebuchadnezzar. He actually talked to them. He found none equal to them. He brought them into his service, and he found them to be better workers than anyone else. And not just a little bit, 10 times better. They were like 10 times plus. If you run your own business or if you manage people, don't you want people 10 times? Come on. Of course you do. You don't want the lazy, mediocre ones, do you? Hope not. We don't around here. 10 times God blesses them and opens a door for them, and his favor is upon them. And we learn something very important about God here. And this might speak directly into your world, into your situation. And it is this: when we stand, God moves. When we stand, God moves. You see, we have the privilege of participating with God in his mission. That's what it means to be a follower of God. We have a privilege and an opportunity to stand out for him in the places and the spaces that he has put us, to see his power, to see his healing, to see his salvation. And as we do that, we make him look good. We make the creator of the universe look good as we stand out for him, as we please him in our lives. And you know, when we make God look good, even the most skeptical person, the most skeptical one, bring one to mind right now. The most skeptical person in your world will probably ask some questions. Why? Because for Daniel, that was King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel and his mates, through the way they stood out for God, they turned King Nebuchadnezzar's head. They turned his head through their faith, through their integrity, through their just way about going about life. Whose head are you turning as you live a life that stands out for God? Think about this for a moment. If they had compromised their beliefs, if they had not had the courage to stand up, would have anything historic would have happened? Would we be having this conversation today if they just decided to blend in? If they said, you know what, this thing's too hard, the world in which I'm living in is too tricky, and they just blended in, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. But they had the courage to stand out for what they believed in. And I don't know about you, but I know with all of my heart, I would much prefer to be remembered for standing out than forgotten for blending in. I'd much rather be remembered for being a person who stands out than simply forgotten for blending in. What about you? What about you? Will you stand with me? Let's have a moment before the Lord. Just want to give you a moment of reflection with the Lord and just ask Him. Ask Him now. Say, Lord, where am I placed before you today? Am I standing out? Or am I blending in? Be honest. Be honest with Him. Am I standing out? Or am I blending in? Let me ask you another question. Have you seen God move in your life or in your world lately? Have you seen Him answer prayer? Have you seen Him move in power? Have you seen Him move in salvation? Because when we make a stand, God moves. But we need to be activated into that. Just ask the Lord now. Let the Holy Spirit minister to your heart. I encourage you to soften yourself before the Lord and His grace and His mercy and His love. God, I thank you so much for the example of Daniel and his mates who stood out for you. And Lord, we thank you for the decisions they predetermined in their heart before the temptation came. And we thank you, Lord, for the stand that they took and they saw you move in power. And Lord, I pray the same for my sisters and my brothers today. Because Lord, our story joins your biggest story. So that shows that you are a redemptive God. You're a God who calls us to stand for you. You're a God who desires to work in our lives because our story actually connects with Daniel's story. So Lord, show us the areas in our lives where we need to make a stand for you. And Lord, if there's areas where we've just totally messed that up, Lord, I pray that we'll confess those to you now. And Lord, you do a work of healing and restoration in our hearts and in our lives. Let's worship the Lord now.
Surrender, all I am is yours.
Lord, we come before you now. And Lord, as we stand, and I encourage you to take a surrendered posture before the Lord now. It might have been some time that you've done this, but surrender yourself before Him and say, Lord, I surrender to you. And I surrender to you, Lord, so I can stand for you. I surrender to you so I can stand for you. And I pray, Lord, as people are surrendering to you, Lord, I pray, Lord, that you'll fill them with your Holy Spirit. I pray, Lord, that you'll give them courage. I pray, Lord, that you'll give them power. I pray, Lord, that you'll give them words. I pray, Lord, that you'll give them the ability to make a stand in the areas of their lives, Lord, to live a life that pleases you, that, Lord, that brings people to you through the way that they live with integrity and love and a dedication to you as their God. Lord, we learn so much from the life of Daniel and his friends. And Lord, we ask today that with surrendered hearts before you, Lord, that you will continue to work and cultivate our inner lives in such a way, Lord, that in our workplaces, in our family, with our friendship groups, as neighbors, Lord, we will be a people who make a stand for you in a relational, in a real way. Lord, for the things that we're for, and Lord, it will turn people's heads to want to know more about you, Lord, and not put people off you. Holy Spirit, do that work in us. Bless and empower families that are here today, that they can do that and be on mission together. And Lord, for those that you are drawing closer and closer towards yourself, Lord, keep revealing yourself to them, I pray. You're a good God, and we love you. And God's people said, amen. Amen. Well, it's so good to be with you today. If you'd like prayer for anything, I'll be down the front, or if you're online, you hit the live prayer button. We'd love to pray with you now. But please, can I encourage you to participate with us across these next few weeks and read through the book of Daniel. You go to clovey.com.au and you can get the Bible reading plan there, or at the information desk as you're leaving today. Go well, God bless, have a great week.